I wasted $3 so I could do some opening joke of eating a strawberry. I'm very good with money.
I've recently played through a little-known indie title called Celeste. It's a 2D side-scrolling platformer with an almost entirely sprite-based art style. The game is about a Canadian woman named Madeline climbing the mysterious Celeste mountain where a bunch of oddities begin manifesting into a physical form, often relating to Madeline's mental state. Her hike up the mountain ends up becoming a personal journey that's heavily themed around mental illness. Not gonna beat around the bush here, I adore this game to fucking pieces! The beautiful art style, the stunning soundtrack, some of the best level design I've ever seen, the beautiful, engrossing narrative, it's quickly become my favorite 2D platformer and made its way into my top 5 favorite games ever. I've been trying to find some excuse to talk about Celeste at length, so fuck it, we're doing top 8 Celeste chapters, boys! And grills. And penguins. There's a total of 8 chapters in the game, so obviously I'm doing sort of a worst to best kind of thing. I'll be focusing on the normal stage at default without taking the B or C routes into consideration, though I imagine whatever I say in relation to gameplay would most likely apply to them anyways. Might go without saying, but since this video goes over pretty much the whole game, spoilers are pretty abundant. If you don't want me to give anything away from this game, now is probably the best time to stop.
You know, as big a challenge as it was to order this whole video, deciding the bottom choice was ironically really simple. Take away from that what you will.
Out of all 8 chapters in Celeste, Chapter 4 Golden Ridge to me is the one that immediately sticks out as the weakest like a sore thumb. The biggest reason for why really just comes down to a good chunk of the chapter forcing you to fight through a bunch of strong wind. I hate wind. Throughout the whole game, most of the chapter-exclusive mechanics make way for a large number of varied platforming challenges, with the levels being appropriately designed around said mechanics. Also doing this without disrupting the flow and pace of gameplay. This is sadly not the case with the Wind and Golden Ridge, since more than anything, the mechanic feels restrictive. The majority of the time, it's constantly pushing you back and putting a limit on the amount of distance you can cover with your jump and dash abilities. I mean, it's probably one of the least annoying instances where I've had to put up with wind in a game, but I don't think it's an enjoyable mechanic here either. With that said though, I wouldn't call Golden Ridge a badly designed chapter, far from it. I may not like the wind mechanic, but to the game's credit, the level design around it is pretty clever and well thought out. A lot of the chapters really take great advantage of how being pushed forward or back affects your interaction with the environment. For example, how the extra push allows for you to jump up a single wall Mega Man X style. It can actually be pretty fun sometimes, mostly whenever the wind is giving you a push forward instead of restricting your movement. I do find the environment to be one of the least interesting in the game, mostly because I couldn't really deduce any major overarching theme like most of the other chapters. But it does look visually appealing, especially with the gorgeous sky in the background. The part that most resonated with me from Chapter 4 is definitely the ending, where Madeline has a panic attack and her friend Theo has to calm her down. Everything from Madeline's perspective begins to go dark and closed in around her, with the music becoming this intense and overpowering tune. Not gonna lie, it's kinda scary how well this scene depicts what an actual panic attack feels like. Everything I described feels like a physical embodiment of what goes on in someone's mind during such an occurrence, though it does lead to a really sweet bonding moment between Madeline and Theo. Theo is a good boy. While Chapter 4 is at the bottom, if the worst I have to say about it is pretty good with a few annoyances, that should speak pretty well for choices later on. When opening up your video game, what you initially present to the player should convey the kind of experience they're in for. establish the tone and mood of what's going down, introduce and teach the basic gameplay mechanics and structure, give the player a red flag that they just wasted all of their money and should immediately refund their purchase. I mean, if your product is shit, at least be upfront and honest about it instead of lying to your consumer. Thankfully, Celeste manages to execute the first chapter, Forsaken City, to great effect. After the brief prologue introduces the player to their dash ability, the first real chapter is where you put it to use with regular platforming and climbing. The challenges at first are dirt simple, mainly to ease the player into the game's general feel. As you progress, the chapter does add more and more to the challenges ahead to communicate some of the more complex and nuanced methods in which you can utilize your minimal moveset, while at the same time making their limitations clear. Also introduced are strawberries that are mostly optional collectibles, which are initially placed out in the open, really easy to get. Though later on, they do make for a number of extra optional challenges, with the strawberry being your reward for figuring out how to accomplish them. Many times, these challenges tend to be a lot harder and require more out-of-the-box thinking than any of the mandatory challenges. It helps to make the linear level structure a lot more interesting to navigate while cluing you in on how following chapters are going to fundamentally work. Unique to Forsaken City are these stoplight platforms, I guess? The way they work is that the platforms quickly move in a specific direction upon contact, and the cool thing about them is that their speed gives your jump an extra push in the direction the platform moves. It makes for some really cool momentum-based level design and obstacles to work around. Forsaken City is pretty light on narrative compared to later chapters, but that's perfectly fine. It works very well as a calm, relaxing start to your journey up Celeste Mountain, along the way introducing you to good boy Theo. In contrast, the end of the chapter leaves off on a bit of a concerning and unsure note, which does foreshadow some unpleasant occurrences. The visuals and music do a phenomenal job capturing the peaceful yet mysterious aura that the foot of the mountain gives off, with the latter also fittingly playing into the level, mechanically building upon itself, starting off with a piano melody but more and more adding various chiptune beats. Not a bad note to start on at all. Probably not that big a surprise, but this mysterious desolate mountain is home to an old haunted building.
What a shock!
But yeah, Chapter 3 Celestial Resort is a thing. Boy, is it one hell of a thing. The note it starts on is pretty ominous, with some aging architecture being covered with this red, black, goopy shit. At first, all you really know about this stuff is that if you touch it, well, dead. It's the main obstacle throughout the whole chapter, with a lot of the challenges around the goop being about utilizing the clean spots on the floor and walls to jump around, precise movements and timing with all of the shit that moves up and down and all around, and these worm things that cover the floor with goop after you step on them, essentially taking away safe ground after use. From my experience, I found this to be among the more challenging levels in Celeste, which is not said lightly considering this game as a whole is pretty fucking hard. At the same time, the obstacles presented, while I wouldn't consider the most satisfying to overcome, I'd say are the most exciting, with the faster paced method that you have to tackle everything with. I adore the amount of visual detail put into the resort's interior to give it an old, decrepit motif. The water leaking and flooding the laundry room, windows broken, something probably going wrong with the ventilation, cobwebs all over the damn place. Hell, even the walls are chipped. It's an admirable amount of effort that really paid off. One part of the level that most stuck out with me was an area where you have to clear some giant mess while going down different pathways in any order you want. While not that huge a thing, the temporary branch off the linearity is pretty cool. Each path getting closed off after you exit can be annoying when trying to collect everything, but in the long run, that's really just a nitpick. The most interesting aspect of Chapter 3 is the ghostly innkeeper, Mr. Oshiro? Ocean Man, take me by the hand, lead me to the land that you understand. Okay, I'm not really sure how you're supposed to pronounce it, so I'll just go with Oshiro. When he comes into play, the entire location is given so many new, different layers of meaning. Mr. Oshiro's constantly overtaken by anxiety and paranoia, which shows pretty blatantly with his attempts to wow Madeline with his hotel and get her to stay the night. It consists of a lot of fretting over basically everything and beating himself up whenever something goes wrong. All the goop you've had to avoid emits from Oshiro's anxiety and builds up in the end like plaque on teeth. A number of journal entries throughout the chapter put into perspective how much the resort means to him. And at least how I see it, Oshiro wanting to impress Madeline with his hotel may also tie into him wanting to be seen as successful and someone of worth. I won't dive into too much more, but the way it all plays out is really heartbreaking, and the ending doesn't exactly help with that either. To sum everything up, the chapter's premise might not be totally new, but in practice, it's quite extraordinary. You remember how earlier in the video I brought up that a lot of weird, out-of-the-ordinary shit happens in Celeste? I feel like a good chunk of you probably know what I'm getting at after the last segment, but just in case, Chapter 2, Old Site. Pretty much the starting point of all of the abnormalities. The chapter starts on an already pretty trippy note with the psychedelic background and green fire. Also, the memorial stone, which was legible in the first chapter, is now continuously being scrambled.
I can only assume that this is what dyslexia feels like.
You've got no clue as to what's happening, and all you can really do at the moment is press forward until you come across a mirror. The figure that's supposed to be your reflection looks a little off, busts out of the mirror, runs off, and opens up the sparkling liquidy things. This odd substance is the main mechanic for this chapter, and the way it functions is upon dashing into it, you'll quickly fly to the other side depending on which of the 8 directions you dash toward. Most often, the obstacles built around said mechanic consist of dashing to the visible open areas, obviously avoiding the walls, to maneuver your way to the goal that'll take you to the next stretch. While there are exceptions, a lot of these obstacles play out more like a puzzle rather than a platforming test, which does make this mechanic stick out from many of the others in the game. It's a fun continuation from Chapter 1 that lets you know despite every stage utilizing your default moveset, each chapter will have a different method of using it. Definitely piqued my interest in seeing the rest of what Celeste had to offer with creative level design, especially with how fun this stage was. I feel like this is also the part of the game where I really got to know more about Madeline as a character. Prior to this, it's made clear that she's climbing Celeste Mountain because of some unexplainable force telling her this is something she needs to do, but not much else aside from that is known about her. Chapter 2 is the point where the overarching themes around mental illness and negative emotions begin cropping up, specifically with how Madeline treats them. While the whole evil copy thing is pretty common in media ranging from video games to crappy YouTube reviews from 2012, I adore how Old Site, and by extension the entire game, handles this trope. The evil copy is a figurative and literal reflection of Madeline's inner negativity and doubt. The ending stretch is a fun, albeit sometimes annoying chase sequence reminiscent of the cosmic clone challenges from Mario Galaxy 2 and 3D Land. On top of that, the whole sequence conveys that one of Madeline's bigger struggles is being easily overwhelmed and intimidated by her own emotional state, choosing to run and leave her problems behind, which at best only gives temporary relief before biting her in the ass even harder sometime later down the line. To be honest, this chapter also kinda struck a few personal chords with me, considering I've been in a mental state not too dissimilar to Madeline's, and yeah, it ain't exactly pleasant. Before this becomes too big a downer, I will bless your day with pictures of cats. And also dogs. My goal is to make everyone happy. While all of Celeste is comprised of 8 main chapters, the final chapter core is more of an endgame epilogue than anything. In addition to completing the main story, you also have to collect a bunch of these crystal hearts to open the pathway at the beginning. All those strawberries you collected throughout the game don't really do anything because all they get used for is a fucking pie. I mean, no disrespect, very noble purpose, but just saying. It takes a bit of extra work to meet the requirements to get into Chapter 8, but the payoff is pretty well worth it. About a year after the main story concludes, Madeline returns to Celeste Mountain to go through the cave center after kooky old bitch over here tells her about it. Going in, I had no clue how they could possibly make an 8th chapter play out. And then I got to the opening area and realized that your dash doesn't recharge. The way dashing works throughout the game is that while you can use it as much as you'd like, you can only do it while airborne once, later twice. While there's other ways to reset it, the most common way you'll be doing it is by landing on safe ground.
Guess what the game's final chapter does not allow you to do? Good luck on your end, you fucking bastard.
You can only reset your dash by either breaking a floating green crystal or by going to a different screen. As a result, the level design is based around the limits placed on your dash ability. With your dash having the aforementioned restriction placed on it, you've got to be conservative with this ability and make sure that you can cross the gap, with the only possible help being a climbable wall or object that'll give you an extra bounce. Knowing this, I already expected a challenge, but oh boy, can't say I anticipated this. The whole chapter is simultaneously a fire level and an ice level. One could draw a loose comparison to other video game levels like Freeze Flame Galaxy, but I describe Chapter 8 less as half and half and more as something you frequently alternate between. The quick shift between these polar opposite themes really conveys how much of a contrast they have if paired side by side. Even if all that really changes is the color scheme and a few graphical details, they're a prime example as to how even something that simple can make all of the difference with theming and atmosphere. One's bright orange and so oppressively hot that the insane temperature would definitely give someone heat stroke. The other is dark blue and cold. The contrast can also be felt just as much with game mechanics as it can with visuals. Dependent on temperature, different objects in the level either can or can't be interacted with. When everything's all fiery, you're able to get an extra boost with all these conveyor belt doohickeys, but touching most other stuff will burn you almost as bad as getting theoretically hyped for software published by EA. Freezing over hell turns the fireballs into spiky ice balls that you can jump across, assuming you don't slip up and impale yourself like an idiot, while at the same time, a few select walls are unclimbable. They really took advantage of this mechanic and provided a number of exciting and chaotic obstacles based around it. Overall, a nice bit of extra endgame content and a fun, rewarding test of all you've learned. We now go to the emotional and physical low point of Madeline's journey, Chapter 6, Reflection. The beginning of the chapter is an endearing conversation between Madeline and Theo. You can either keep the talk going or immediately go to bed. It's entirely optional and doesn't have any effect on later game events, but the entire moment is a cute exchange that helps you unwind after all of the previous chaos, just as both characters here are doing, only to get thrusted right back into said chaos after Madeline attempts to go to her negative side and quote-unquote set her free. It backfires pretty fucking horribly, knocking Madeline off the mountain where she begins to continuously fall. And fall. And fall. And fall. She survives by landing in the water because water will actually cushion all impact from falling at such a great height. Totally not gonna break every bone in your body and have the exact same impact as hitting solid concrete. A+ for realism. Because of the massive drop, you're pretty far down and really left with the only option of just going wherever. After all you've endured in previous chapters, especially in Chapter 5, which we'll talk about soon, Reflection in comparison is quite a breather. It has all of the same style of level design as prior chapters, with exclusive mechanics being an obvious exception to this, but the way it's all designed feels like the chapter's purpose is to get you in a mellow state and treat each challenge as, for lack of a better description, a step-by-step ballet rehearsal. Many of the challenges are based around the angle of trajectory you get from these circular platforms. Also, these weird blocks that move in one direction depending on where you strike them, which make for some clever momentum and precision-based puzzles. Though the coolest addition is this gold feather that lets you fly briefly. It takes a bit to get accustomed to the semi-wide turning range, but damn is it fun to use. It's all so mesmerizing, reinforced by the especially gorgeous artwork and soft music. For as peaceful as the chapter is, you can't help but dwell on how you got so close with the end in sight, only to fall back so far. At the same time, it's a vital moment of realization for Madeline's character. Instead of this doppelganger being all the negativity she needs to leave behind, she considers that maybe it's her fear and anxiety personified in need of comfort and reassurance. I hate to get real again, but as someone that's been through a lot of anxiety-related shit, seeing the way that Celeste handles a subject like mental illness really hit home with me. It's something that'll always be a part of somebody, but it is possible to understand and work with it to cease it being hurtful, and maybe even turn it into something beneficial. All this topped off with a boss fight against your other self that's nothing short of incredible. I believe that a hard game should ideally have some kind of breathing room to ease back on the player, and the way Celeste did it with Chapter 6 more than sufficed. It very good. As it turns out, once you get to know Purple Hair Clone, she actually isn't all that bad. So now you can finally reach the top of the mountain with her help. The 7th and final chapter in the main story sees the ultimate payoff of all that transpired in Chapter 6. Chapter 7, The Summit, is about Madeline making her way to... well, take a guess. I trust you're smart enough to figure out where she's going. It's broken up into 7 different segments, most of which are themed around all the previous chapters. With the exception of the starting area based on Chapter 6, the order is dependent on the chronological order of each chapter, which also relates to how high up the mountain each level is located at. As probably expected, all the obstacles and mechanics make a return for each theme, functioning the same basic way, just with different, more challenging level structure. In addition to this, as a result of Madeline and her clone making peace with each other, you now get a second dash on top of your default one. Consequently, the level design for each segment takes into account the extra height and distance the second dash can get. The design is very intuitive and does a good job intertwining the new ability with familiar obstacles. It's a really fun level that both refreshes you on what you've already gotten through in previous chapters, and acts as sort of a test of how well versed you've become with the platforming. If we're talking thematically, with how Madeline gets through each segment more quickly than the chapter they're all based around, the idea conveyed here, I feel, is resulting from Madeline and the copy working together. Everything she had to endure, which proved difficult on her own, becomes a breeze when both of the two work together instead of fight against each other. It's a really uplifting outcome, demonstrating how much she's grown as a character since the start of her journey. In between each segment is Madeline and her copy reminiscing about the whole journey, which I thought was really touching, especially seeing the copy go from willing to try but unsure about whether they'll succeed to fuck yeah boy, we're doing this shit. I adore the soundtrack used for this chapter. It goes through different variations in each section, but always retains the same uplifting and optimistic tune. It just screams, hey, you've done all of this before. You're stronger now. You can do it again. You've got this. A simple but very effective detail about the final gameplay segment is how the last set of checkpoints are all marked off by numbered flags. Watching the numbers go down makes this last stretch all the more exciting, and the moments you reach the top feel legitimately incredible. It was a long, hard journey for our protagonist, but the destination proved to be absolutely worth the effort. By process of elimination, y'all probably deduced ahead of time that the top pick is Chapter 5. Ideally, if you were paying attention, which, if you weren't, start again. This is all gonna be on the test and the semester final, so you better study. My initial feelings toward the Mirror Temple were that I liked the chapter, but didn't feel like it stood out as much as some of the others. Though as I began to process all of the thematic and mechanical elements of Chapter 5, I grew to adore it more and more, with Madeline having some not so great experiences with mirrors in prior chapters, what with purple hair clone breaking through them all the time. Even the very idea of a setting called the Mirror Temple is frightening, let alone setting foot inside of it. Something as minor a detail like Madeline's reflection showing multiple times in the background is enough to make me feel uneasy. Right out of the gate, you're introduced to platforms that go off in one particular direction upon dashing, and these red orbs that shoot you off in one direction for as long as there's nothing in front of it. They start off as fun little mechanics, which the level eases the player into with how they function and interact with the environment. But later they serve as a method of thrusting the player deeper and deeper into this uncomfortable situation. Further into the temple, most of the rooms are completely shrouded in darkness, and the only source of illumination are these light crystalline torches. Design-wise, lighting them up is a subtle, cool way to subconsciously map your way around the various rooms. You can never quite know what's up ahead without lighting your way, and even then the torches only light up so much, so the setting gives off a sense of anxiety and paranoia, constantly making you worried about, say, whether going down will lead you into a death pit, or if a monster is lurking somewhere in the temple. While the blue lights are mostly associated with places that are safe and provide a sense of comfort, the yellow lights are associated with danger, causing even the most mundane of objects to induce paranoia simply from yellow light being present. Chapter 5 has a mostly straightforward conflict about Theo going missing and Madeline searching for him in the temple. Pretty simple on the surface, but it's more or less a catalyst to bring their emotions and insecurities out into a physical form. It was only when Madeline got sucked into a mirror and transported to some warped reality where I truly got what this chapter was trying to convey, aside from showing off spoopy shit. This entire dimension is formed around both Madeline and Theo's worries and fears, with Madeline being chased down by these terrifying creatures that resemble a statue she came across earlier, and Theo being trapped in a crystal constantly monitored by eyes relating to how he feels judged by all those watching. They're not afraid of something real, but something that might be real, which ironically enough ends up being what gives their anxieties a tangible form. The element that takes this all to an even higher level is the music. The normal track is a peaceful yet somber and depressing piano melody, while the mirror dimension reverses and distorts the original track. A pretty cool Easter egg is that the audio file contains hidden dialogue that's, kind of unsettling. If you don't want to listen to it, feel free to skip to this timestamp. As a whole, Chapter 5 is among the most engrossing narrative moments I've ever seen a game pull off. I could never see this work in any other media because of how much of it is conveyed strictly through the already masterful game design. It perfectly conveys how frightening things like mental illness or even just regular human emotions can be, but shows there is light at the end of the tunnel. You just gotta keep going. Oh, and before I take off, I have to reinforce that Theo is a good boy. Protect him or die.